The fundamental question around the whole Team Canada play is, can a prime minister in such a weakened position present a strong forward posture?
How can a set of skills lead you down the path to success? That's what we're setting out to answer on the EdUp Canada podcast. I'm your host, Michael Sangster. Join me as we unpack how leaders around the world have taken training and skills and turned that into a lasting career. Now let's learn together. Welcome back to the EdUp Canada podcast. I'm Michael Sangster, your host, and I am excited to have two guests on today. One I know very well. We were just chatting, and I think it's about 35 years we've known each other. Scott Reid from Festcheck Reid, from CTV News, from Paul Martin days, Liberal Politics, which is where we know each other, and Alex Panetta, who's the CBC correspondent in Washington, and he's agreed to join us. We've met over the years, I think, a few times, but wouldn't even say we know each other well. He's agreed to join us today to talk a little bit about on an end-of-year show here about what's going on Canada-U.S. politics, what's going on in Ottawa this week a little bit too. Lots of stuff going on. So, gentlemen, thanks for joining us.
Good to be here.
Great to be here, man. And don't tell anybody else that we've known each other for 34 years, okay? That's a depressing
It's been a long time, but long gaps of seeing each other have helped.
Yeah, no, that makes it go down easier. But the enormous passage of time is still it's soul destroying.
I believe we sat at the same stadium for a Grey Cup in Regina one year with when Paul Martin was Prime Minister. Actually,
technically no, because what happened, if you remember, is on the Saturday night, Mr. Martin became Liberal leader and therefore Prime Minister designate. And on the Sunday, we went to the Grey Cup and he brought all the premiers together and we had a kind of an improvised, relaxed, informal First Ministers meeting, watched the game in minus 38 degrees Celsius weather. I think I drank about a quart of cherry whiskey to try to stay warm. And then a week later or so, he was technically installed as PM.
Here's a fun factoid. All three of us were there because I was part of the traveling press contingent. And I guess unlike the rest of you guys, like as part of the press, they kicked me out, I think, right as the game started. So I got to stay warm the entire game at some hotel nearby.
Well, you had it better off, man. I really froze.
I was kept warm by beverages. It's funny. It leads me to a Stephen Harper story. I remember watching him at a Grey Cup in Edmonton, the coldest I've been to. Been to about 30 games over my lifetime because I'm a big Grey Cup guy. And watched him sign autographs for about an hour in the cold with people and take photos at a game. It was pretty impressive to watch him do that. It was about minus 40 that day in Edmonton too. So I had the pleasure of having Peter Mansbridge on here in the spring, and he taught me a lesson. And it's a CBC appropriate story. He said, throw out your questions and let's talk. So that's what we're doing today. We actually had him come speak at our conference too. And as we're walking up to the podium, he said, get rid of those questions, get rid of the piece of paper. Let's have a conversation. So Scott Reid got line of the week, as far as I'm concerned, in political coverage this week, talking about Mark Carney, who said, why, if you're wearing charcoal pants, would you walk into a fire? Did anybody see what happened with Chrystia Freeland this week coming? I did not see that coming.
Well, I think the most important observation is that the Prime Minister clearly didn't see it coming. He so didn't see it coming that he sat down with her on a Friday to tell her that she was doing a terrible job. She should leave her post on Tuesday, but first he'd like her to deliver the fall economic statement on the Monday. It's just inconceivable to me that A, you could have that meeting and think it's going to go well, and then B, leave that meeting and think, well, everything's tickety-boo. I guess I'll just go watch my shows for the weekend because everything here in the ship of state is sailing smoothly. And obviously, it was a dramatic mistake, and she blew a gigantic hole in the hull.
And proceeded to also leave her hanging all weekend publicly. That never once stepped up over that weekend and defended her either.
We've been hearing here, even here in Washington, about some sort of disunity within the Canadian government for a while. And the rumors reached here because ministers come down here all the time, right? They often want to, give that press conference atop the embassy with the Capitol in the backdrop. And there's been this tug of war within the government of Canada about who's going to get that stage time in dealing with the United States, which frankly is going to be one of the bigger stages in Canadian politics over the coming year. And there's been this tension within the ministry, and we'd heard between Freeland and Trudeau, or at least their camps themselves, and I think some of that was reported publicly, over the last few months. And then to do exactly what Scott described last week when that was already lingering there in the ether is pretty extraordinary. Not as extraordinary, in my opinion, as the letter that she published on her way out the door.
I think that was the lever hanging, but the poignancy of that letter, the writing of that piece of work, was it a hole in the hull, as he said, Scott?
Well, once she decided that she was going to resign, she made a second decision, which was that she was going to compete for the top job. And that letter and the timing of its release, everything was perfectly calculated to cause maximum harm. And if you think about it, to just almost in one swoop, shift the public narrative around Chrystia Freeland and how she is perceived publicly as a political actor, right? So she goes from being directly and indisputably attached to Trudeau to being quite distinct and separate and critical of Trudeau. She goes from being part and parcel, the high spending, profligate ways, to being a voice of fiscal rectitude and positions herself as the more responsible economic player to such a degree that, she says she had to fall out. And she positions herself, because she ends her letter by saying that she intends to reoffer in the next election and run for re-election in her riding. She positions herself clearly as someone who has an eye on the future, all of which I think kind of redefined her. So now you hear people talking in liberal circles going, well, Christia's making calls and Christia's going to be the next leader and she's repositioned. She suddenly moved way back up that rung, the rungs on that ladder of would-be leadership aspirants should Trudeau step aside.
We touched on a little bit, Alex. What else are you hearing on the Washington side of this? Because her letter definitely refers to the importance of Trump, the importance of having the fiscal state of the nation, which is a little bit of irony considering the numbers they announced on, was it Tuesday? The whole week's a bit of a blur. Monday or Tuesday, I can't even remember anymore. But what are you picking up at your end, Alex?
So at the outset, this was not a huge story in the United States. Chrystia Freeland's letter, generated a lot of buzz in political circles. She knows a lot of people here, right? Some senior executives in different newsrooms in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere in the United States were colleagues of hers or reported to her. So, it generated some buzz in that sense. But, if it was really at best a below the fold on, front page story in the United States, because you'll appreciate that there is a Niagara Falls quality gusher of news already happening in this country, right? Connected to the presidential transition. There's so much, we might talk about it later, but there's so much happening here. But that changed a little bit with Donald Trump's tweet, or whatever you call that, Truth Social post a few hours later, referring to her departure. And then the next day when he makes fun of Canada, kicks Canada in the shins again. And then suddenly it's generating more of a media conversation here. And you're seeing the evening talk shows here on the cable networks, not so much talking about Chrystia Freeland, but connecting the Freeland story to Trudeau's fate. And that's become the big story here.
So let's segue right into what you said there. You wrote an interesting piece this morning I read on CBC News. I think it's worth seeing. You're, I won't say optimistic, but you're reporting the good signs happening in Washington right now between Canada and the U.S.
Yeah, so we'll put it in context. Good within the context of a president who's talking about annexing Canada, insulting the prime minister on a daily basis, and bidding good riddance to the deputy prime minister. He's basically been trashing. I referred in that piece to sort of him roasting Canada on a daily basis like a maple glazed ham. But despite all that sizzle of all those punchlines and all the mockery on Fox News of Canada and it becoming a state and all that stuff, I think really substantive and interesting things happened yesterday. I don't think it's an accident that multiple actors in Trump's orbit declared victory on the tariff thing with Canada, right? His campaign puts out a social media post saying another win from Trump because we got Canada to do all this stuff about the border, which we can talk about in a second. His transition team puts out a press release linking to a Wall Street Journal article and saying, again, Trump's already making progress, already making the border safer. He's not even president yet. His incoming White House press secretary posted on social media about it. And I think I'm missing a fourth. Oh, yeah. We also went up to the Hill. We talked to Capitol Hill Republicans who were like, look at this. This is what strong leadership gets you. We're really happy with what Canada's done. And what Canada did is a bunch of stuff, not only at the border itself, but related to fentanyl trafficking and organized crime and migration, just like literally 5 or 6 policies. And I think quite a serious attempt to address the substance of Trump's complaints about migration and drug trafficking. And so you look at that and say, okay, to me, it raises the political cost of Trump imposing tariffs now, which he could still do. And that's why I say I'm optimistic within reason, right? But if Trump imposes those tariffs, notwithstanding what he said yesterday, he's got to now risk losing the cooperation he's been celebrating, losing that win that he's the victory lap that he's been taking. he risks bumping into adverse public opinion. There are 2 polls out now in the United States on putting tariffs on Canada, right? And both of them show a majority disapproval of the idea. And usually the tariffs are popular in the United States, generally, depending on how you ask the question in a poll. But asked specifically about tariffs on Canada, the 2 surveys were, I think, within the margin of error of each other. And they're like 51, 52% opposed, 31, 32% in favor, a huge majority of independents opposed, to swing voters. So what that tells me is, it's not like crushing opposition, but it's enough to sort of give pause to an incoming president who wants to start his presidency on a good terms. And then the third cross current he runs into if he imposes these tariffs is raising the cost of goods, right? Like he got elected on a promise to lower inflation, or at least to keep costs constrained. And then you're risking the chance that sort of you contribute to inflation. So by imposing tariffs now, after declaring a win, you basically created 3 negative sets of conditions for yourself. And that's why I think the chances of those potentially devastating tariffs ever being imposed just reduced, I think, significantly yesterday. I wouldn't declare a victory lap if I were Canada, but I think we're closer than we were 3 days ago.
You never take a victory lap with this guy, because that's the last thing that he wants to ever see you do either, right? That's not going to help you in the long run. I'm intrigued. I think we all watched with interest Mar-a-Lago trip from Justin Trudeau. But Scott, you're sitting on this side of the border. There's 3 premiers that have probably been more active, Alberta, Ontario, and Quebec, on these issues. I'm interested in your perspective of how they've each handled it. And you've been in that place. You've been in the finance minister's office. You've been in the prime minister's office. How much coordination do you think is happening? Do we have a Team Canada approach right now or not?
I think we're attempting to have a Team Canada approach. I think the fundamental question around the whole Team Canada play is, can a prime minister in such a weakened position present a strong forward posture? And it's very, very difficult. And the events of this week have made it even more difficult. So I doubt that Premier Ford, as an example, who has been out and about this week, and Premier Legault, I doubt that they're plugging in too much into Ottawa. I think they're probably just doing their own thing now. I do think there's a logic to what they're doing that you can rationalize and say, well, this is actually evidence of a well-coordinated national strategy, not a federal strategy, but a national strategy, if you will, one that employs premiers and then ultimately business people and union leaders as well. Because you kind of want good cop, bad cop. You want Doug Ford saying, hey, listen, guys, we're going to turn the damn lights out on you, right? And that relieves the prime minister of awkward obligation of playing the tough guy, especially since we assume that his relationship with Trump is strained and that Trump might take tough talk coming from the leader of the country, whom he's not affectionate, a little differently. So I think you can see evidence of that. I just want to add one thing. I hope to God Alex is right, but I'm very pessimistic that this celebration of Trump and his people about early action on the border, their flex that they did yesterday, saying, see, we're getting results. I'm very pessimistic that inherently means they'll be discouraged from applying tariffs for 2 reasons. One, I don't think that's why they're pursuing tariffs. I think they told us they have a whole series of objections about the border because that folds into the bigger border story, which is driven by what's happening with Mexico. But I think that was rationale. I don't think that's the reason. I think the truth of the matter is they want the income. They've got a thesis about governing where they're going to generate revenues off of tariffs, and they're going to use that to try to propel their administration. I think that will fail, but it will take time to fail. And so I'm less optimistic that means that they're going to lay off of those tariffs after January 20th. The second reason I'm skeptical and pessimistic about it is that Alex's analysis is so perfectly correct, right? Like if you watch them spike the football and declare victory, well, then you would say you would never, therefore, undo that victory or undermine that victory by then proceeding nevertheless. But this guy is absolutely capable of doing that, does it all the time. So he can claim victory, then go ahead and do it anyway and say, well, I want more. First of all, I think we're getting screwed on a bunch of goods. He keeps talking about, the account deficit, the trade deficit that he has, and seeing that as evidence that America's getting screwed. So he'll just go back to peddling those lines. I just think ultimately it will be the negative impact on cost of living for Americans. And that 51, 52% opposed will swell to 73. And at that point, they'll start to back off of these things. But that's going to take a few months to happen and to be felt and to filter through. And I think in the meantime, we're going to get the stuffing kicked out of us.
There's a third option, by the way, right? So, and just to sort of add an asterisk here, that I'm certainly not prepared to predict he's gonna pull off pull back from that threat. But I think the chances of it have increased the last couple of days. But the third option, putting on tariffs, not putting on tariffs. The third is you announce them in a way that they don't immediately bite, right? And there's different ways you could do that. One of them, and Scott would know this better than me, having worked in the finance department in Canada. But one of the things you could do is announce them and actually implement them relatively quickly using some sort of national emergency provision in the Trade Act of 1974. But it takes a while
that
to
means
start.
like an EO on January 20th or 21st. That's what I've been expecting, right?
Yeah. However, what my understanding is that it doesn't take effect at the border right away because it takes a while to sort of update the codes. And so let's just assume for example, that at 2:06 p.m. on January 20th, 2025, he puts out an executive order. We're imposing tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China, right? Well, at 2:07 p.m., border agents in Plattsburgh, New York, or in Washington State are not going to have access to sort of these new tariff codes. So what's going to happen is it's going to take a while to sort of implement them. And it could take weeks. It could even take months to get all the books updated. And then in the meantime, you say, well, when these things finally take effect, we'll apply them retroactively to January 20th, right? In the meantime, some serious conversations end up happening. And that's where Canada really faces a gun to its head. And that's kind of the gray area between, having tariffs and not having tariffs.
Let's go back to Canadian politics then. You both touched on it. I actually think you kind of framed it differently, Scott, than Alex, but you're actually agreeing with saying it differently, both of you. I don't think either one of you is overly optimistic on what can happen there, but that's just I've
got a stool and a length of rope waiting for me when this pod is over. That's how optimistic I am.
Always good for the line. Scott has always been witty with the line. You touched on it earlier. Justin Trudeau's position right now, that's not a position of strength to be doing any kind of negotiations with anybody. And does he even make it to January? Does he make it to the 15th or let's say the 20th? Does he make it to the U.S. inauguration? I don't see it.
Look, if you're asking me, I made such a monkey's uncle out of myself this past 3-4 days by going on television and making predictions. There was a point on Monday, both you guys know from having worked in and around politics and certainly media, that occasionally the Prime Minister's office, what we call like the media advance, the tech guys, PCO tech, they will give networks a heads up, right? Not a formal indication that something is about to happen, but they'll say to us, okay, guys, in a couple hours, make certain you've got cameras ready in this position because the Prime Minister is going to make an announcement or might make an announcement, all this sort of stuff. There was a point on Monday where the networks, and I know this because I then had to sit strapped into a computer doing live coverage for a couple hours. We were told to expect the Prime Minister to rise in the House of Commons at 2 p.m., indicate that he was proroguing Parliament and he was stepping down as Prime Minister. And we sat there for an hour and 15 minutes reporting on the furniture because there was nothing.
I watched. You did a good job. You did a good job talking about the furniture.
And then, boom, they come out and they go, actually, yeah, the Prime Minister's he's considering whether or not to resign, which is one hell of a weak thing. I'm going to consider whether or not we're going to get a divorce, but listen, until otherwise notified, we're still married, honey. I don't think you tell the country that you're thinking about breaking up. So I think his position is incredibly weak, weaker than perhaps even he believes. If he makes it through this week and retires for Christmas, then I think at some point in January, the crushing realities of all of this start to impose on him. It is obvious that if he doesn't prorogue the House, the NDP will no longer support him, and he gets the first opposition day is going to be cooked. So he can't keep his government alive much past the end of February, beginning of March. That's the best case scenario. He faces a very real prospect that cabinet ministers and caucus could do a much more robust revolt. And I do think that this conversation about tariffs and the inauguration fit into it because his indecision or his unwillingness to acknowledge political reality starts to get mashed up with the sense of crisis around this gigantic, enormous economic threat of tariffs, where people say, we don't have the luxury of indulging your indecision or your delusion that you're still in a position to direct the country right now, because we have to deal with this menace. And I think that further weakens his position and further creates an imperative on the part of caucus to take him out. So I just don't see a scenario. Maybe he waits until the first week of January. second week of January. I just don't see a scenario where he can get through January. Certainly he can't get through to March. So one way or another, he's gone. I just think he'll be forced out in January if he doesn't go voluntarily.
Well, and everything you said kind of walks back to Chrystia Freeland's letter about the importance of the Canada-US January, everything that's going on. I agree with you on that. Sorry, Alex, go ahead.
Yeah, just trying to put myself in his shoes. I mean, what's a better way to walk out that door? Is it to sort of, I'm leaving because my closest political ally over the last decade has knifed me over a policy dispute and my own betrayal of her, or saying, look, I spent Christmas with my children and I want to spend more time with them. I mean, to me, it's a more elegant departure. I mean, again, within the set of circumstances he faces. One thing I'm actually curious about, and I've not worked in partisan politics, and I'm just kind of curious about how quickly this thing could go down. If he decides in January that he wants to step down, how quickly could the Liberal Party organize a leadership race to replace him? Like, is this something that could happen in weeks or would it take months?
Scott, you'd have a much better idea these days.
Look, again, no one's opinion is worth a pinch more than the next person's, because this is all kind of, never been there before territory. I think there are kind of two broad scenarios. One is, and the most likely scenario, because it's kind of the most conventional, is that you would have a full leadership contest and selection process where party members would vote, even though they're called party supporters now and all that kind of stuff, whatever. And that would mean that the Prime Minister would have to prorogue the House, I think. You'd have to prorogue the House and give them 3 months to select a new leader, because you can't have the House you can't campaign for the leadership while the House is in session in such a precarious spot. The government would fall. So he'll probably prorogue the House before the 25th of January and then say there's going to be a leadership. Party's going to pick a new leader in whatever, beginning of April, and then the House resumes. That will get pushback, though. So this takes us to the second scenario, because the country will say, listen, it's nice that you Liberals want to get your crap together, but meanwhile, we're dealing with Trump. The House isn't in session. Where's the government's actual authority to govern? So there would be pushback to that. If the government feels particularly sensitive to that, if the caucus feels particularly sensitive to it, the cabinet, they could go for an unconventional British-style play where they go, you know what, guys, we're going to meet at 2:00 in the reading room, all of the Liberal members of Parliament, and we're going to pick a leader on an interim basis. That person will become the Prime Minister as the leader of the party on this kind of basis, and that person will take us through the next few months, take us through an election campaign, and that'll be ratified by a vote of the membership at some future point. Of course, that gets pushed back because it feels like it's a much less democratic exercise, much less enfranchised exercise. But those are the two scenarios. And by the way, whichever scenario follows almost certainly produces a different person. Because if it's an intramural selection process, it's a confidence and beauty contest where the jury is the existing members of cabinet and caucus. If it's a broader campaign with, signups and so forth, then it's a much more wide open fire wagon exercise.
The one thing I liked about this week was that our friend and the good guy, Dominic LeBlanc, shined. I enjoyed watching him get a round of applause because he's a decent human being and a good guy and a very strong cabinet minister, right?
Yep. And I think his name is the most likely to emerge if you have that caucus play. And I'm not the first to say that. Lots of people have said it. I just think that a lot of caucus and cabinet would say, this guy's the best athlete on the floor, so let's give him the ball. Stop screwing around.
And our old friend Christy Clark sitting there is also very strong, I think, potential, but whether she'd have the support or not, but ready for prime time.
I've heard good things about LeBlanc even down here. One thing I'm not entirely clear on is why anyone wants that job right now. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I'd be like, if I had leadership aspirations, I'd be like, let's
always want the job, man.
I don't understand. I mean, again,
I've had people stop me in bars and coffee shops all the time and ask me that question. Like, who would even want it? It's like, you know what? They want to be prime minister. And they all believe, yeah, we might be dead and taken for granted, but if I was the prime minister, I could turn it around because I have magnificent skills and a dazzling smile. They all believe that, bud.
Yeah, like I know, like, I don't know. I guess if you want to be John Turner or Kim Campbell, I mean, it's a rough spot to be in 1984 or 1993, right? But I'm looking at this and saying, again, never having worked in politics and thinking, let's let the next person be the fall guy, and I'll see you in 3 years.
Let's talk about you guys for a second. We always put people on the spot with 2 questions. And then Scott added one we're going to touch on. So maybe we'll start with that one. Scott, you wanted to talk about your favorite 70s sitcom today. I took Saved by the Bell.
I was just kidding. Well, it's not technically the 70s. If we're going to go that way, then I'm definitely going with Get Smart. Like all my kids have watched every episode of Get Smart. I'm a fanatic for that show.
I think you're right. I changed the 70s and you pivoted. We originally talked about best 90s sitcom, which is where
I
Saved
didn't
by
watch
the Bell.
sitcoms in the 90s. I was too busy trying to destroy the nation's finances.
My memories only date back to roughly 1979 or 1980, so I don't have the best handle on 70s sitcoms. But I have seen some episodes of All in the Family, which is pretty funny. I don't think you'd have it on TV these days, but it's some good lines in there.
It's funny how our kids now watch our shows and listen to our music, though. So my records get worn out by my kids listening to my old albums. So let's talk about you guys, your own skill sets, your own reasons. We talk to our career college students through this podcast and some of our college owners to talk about the kind of things they teach, the kind of things they touch people on. So talk to me about the skill that you have, Alex, first, that you think's made you successful. And did you have it early in life or later in life?
That's an excellent question. Skill, well, my primary skill in becoming a journalist was hating math. I'm not sure I'd necessarily push that on anyone else. I love storytelling. And that's kind of how I entered journalism, is enjoying writing. But over time, it's funny is that you change, your set of interests changes. And actually, as time's gone on, I've begun to enjoy the discovery part of journalism more than the writing part. Now it's almost like a letdown when you got to sit down and write the story because you're like, I've learned all this cool stuff. And it's the learning the cool stuff part that animates me now. And frankly, the absolute best thing about being a journalist is deciding I want to write about the potential effect of artificial intelligence on the labor market. Let me pick up the phone and call one of the godfathers of artificial intelligence or email him. And he might actually pick up the call, right? It's incredible. And I sometimes risk taking for granted that privilege that I have. That if I did something else for a living, I'm not sure that I could wake up in the morning with a question I'm asking myself and have one of the world's great experts on that question take my call. Anyway, it's not exactly the question you asked, but basically I love telling stories. I love writing. And as time's gone on, I've learned to love just all the things I get to discover through my job.
Kind of an interesting segue there, because Scott, you were in politics. You were much more successful and were in higher offices, but we got to meet really neat people and work with really neat people. And I got friends that just joke about my Rolodex, the amount of people we can pick up the phone, a former clerk here, a minister here, a prime minister there, right? It is a neat thing we've managed to do. And so I'm interested to see, I think I know what your skill is that's beyond other, and it's your sarcastic wit. But as a communications tool, you deliver messages with your wit better than I think anybody in Canada.
Well, I don't know about that, but I suppose you could hone a sense of humor, but I don't really think of that as a great skill. I just want to say something about what you were mentioning there, and your time as a journalist, Alex, and how it's given you access and entree to a whole cast of exciting and interesting people. And Mike, what you're saying about dealing with, when you work in politics and who it exposes you to. Like I was communications director of the Prime Minister of the country when I was 33 years old. And at the age of 33, I said to myself, for what I do, for what floats my boat, this is the best job I'm ever going to have. Like I knew it then, right? So like I was never one of those guys that sped through each day, taking it all for granted. Like I always was thinking to myself, almost in a way that was kind of depressing and melancholy. I was always like, oh my God, man, look at this. I'm walking up the steps of Parliament Hill. I get to go in the members entrance, as a senior staffer of the Prime Minister. Look at this. We're having a G7 summit and I'm, in the Oval Office with the President of the United States. Like I was always, you have to like put your game face on and get through those moments. You can't just like sit around and fanboy. But I was always highly conscious of the fact that I was extraordinarily privileged. And, that's why I say to young people when I teach a course at Queen's now and, you get asked to guest lecture. And I always say, go do a couple of years in government. Just go do it, man, because it may or may not be for you, but it is a meritocracy still. There's 13 people working, almost all of them under the age of 35 in a minister's office. 2 of them are gamers, and those people will find themselves at important tables with important people. I don't know anywhere else where you can learn about polling, learn about public opinion, learn about policy, learn about communications, learn about business, and have access to all those people. Like, it's an incredible speed up the ladder if you're lucky and you work at it.
I look at a guy like Duncan Fulton.
Yeah.
What is he? Tim Hortons now, or he was a senior executive at Canadian Tire,
running Tim's, and he could easily be the next head of restaurants. Yep.
And that guy, I bet if we had him here, we'd be talking about the experience he took out of working on Parliament Hill that gave him the confidence, the network, and all those skill sets. So I'm going to stick with you, Scott, for the last question we ask everybody. And it's interesting because every time we've done this, I've had a different name, but one of them I'm going to mention to you because in one of the early episodes, I talked about one of the mentors I had who I didn't make a career decision without talking to him for quite a while. That was Mike Robinson. And Mike was one of those guys. We had a funny relationship. We talked, we'd play golf once in a while, but we always had a conversation going back from being on the executive of the party from the Calgary convention together. And there wasn't a lot of non-Chrétien people around that table. There was, let's see, him and me. We were the only two for 4 years. And he was one of those guys. But talk to me about a mentor that's made your difference, because we like to send this message out to people that you can make a difference tomorrow mentoring someone.
Well, Mike was among those people. He had that's not my answer, but I just want to mention because he's such a remarkable person and he should be remembered glowingly, because one of the things living forever in Ottawa, Mike Robinson, who was the founder, head of Earnscliffe in his earliest origin days, Mike had an affability, obviously very smart guy, obviously very skilled, but he had something I've always lacked, and that is the ability to get along with anyone. And people just inherently liked Mike. That was his superpower because he's such a lovely person. I really, really miss him. For me, the answer, I don't know if this breaks the rules or how the question works, but I'm that guy who had that high school teacher. My high school teacher, we remain in contact to this day. My high school history teacher is also the assistant football coach of my team. Outside of family, almost certainly had the greatest influence in terms of shaping my life because he taught me how to think. Like through teaching history in grade 10 and grade 12, and even through lining me up on the football field where I should be, what I should be thinking about in terms of assignments, he taught me how to think critically, ask questions, don't assume what everybody else is talking about is exactly what you should be thinking, check your own assumptions, imagine what else might happen, peek around the corner. None of it was ever expressed that way, but he literally taught me how to think. He taught me how to think critically. And I just, huge influence.
Oh, I think there's a lot of those stories. I follow up with one.
Chuck McWhorter.
Do you think
from Kennington?
Do you think he knows that he was that mentor to you?
Yeah, he does, because I embarrassingly said it in front of about 1,500 people. I was asked to go back to my high school and give a speech, and all the student body was there and a bunch of alumni. And then I got emotional. So it was terrible. So I talked about him, got emotional. Then I could barely shake his hand.
How about you, Alex? Do you have one that pops to brain or more than one?
Yes, I've been blessed with a few great teachers. Rob Russo was the bureau chief of the Canadian Press in Ottawa when I was there. I mean, taught me so much about interviewing and storytelling and working sources and just generally about life. But I want to mention the guy by the name of Don McKenzie. He was the bureau chief at the Canadian Press in Montreal, and he made a tremendous difference in my life, because I just want to sort of go back to this day in late 1999. I was on probation. I had just started there. And I was so happy to have that job. I remember after getting it, I walked out of that interview and just shouting for joy on a sidewalk in Old Montreal outside that building. And I just begun. And a couple of weeks later, I made a catastrophic mistake. I was working the night shift, translating French copy into English in the Montreal Bureau. There was a reference at some point in a French story to two people who'd passed away, two people who died. And I translate, and it referred to the person and then this guy was retiring, and it was, and one of the reasons for him retiring was the death of his right-hand man, and the death of his wife. Anyway, I translated it thinking it's kind of weird that they mentioned the wife second. So I the death of his wife and his right-hand man. Anyway, I made a mistake. What had happened is these two people had perished in a plane crash. I had made an incorrect assumption about who the fatalities were. Anyway, this person was on the board of the Canadian Press. All right. And basically, we got phone calls the next day saying, what the heck happened? You've killed off the spouse of an important person. And my boss was asked whether we should, cut this kid loose. I just begun like 2 weeks earlier. I was still on probation. It was a period where they could easily let me go. And he stepped up for me and said, no, I think this kid's got potential. And changed my life. I mean, I've seen a lot of places and talked to a lot of interesting people I never would have met and things I never would have seen had it not been for Don McKenzie, and I'm grateful. It's kind of a lesson that, a little bit of patience with a young kid and understanding can change a life.
I worked with a great gentleman out of Winnipeg, Mr. Abe Simkin, that kind of had a theory of the world. He mentioned to me one night when we were having dinner was break some eggs, make some mistakes. If you're not making mistakes, you're not trying things too. Yours is a different example, but
it's pretty bad. It was a bad mistake. And I was 20. I was like 22 years old, and I learned it. I learned to never take for granted that somebody's written something poorly when you're translating, and ask yourself why it was written that way in the first place.
I don't want to turn this into old days corner, but do you remember, Alex? I have this distinct memory when you came to Ottawa of you and Nala had just started. You and Nala Ayad, and that's when I first remember you. The pair of you together asked me and Ruth Thorkelson to go for lunch, and I remember that lunch. And I'm not sure when it was. Probably the late '90s, early 2000s. I'm guessing. But I remember that now, like I watch you on TV every night, or see you here commenting and read your stuff. And obviously Nala's crushing it. I just saw her. She was emceeing an event a couple of weeks ago. And I think back to that lunch. I'm like, wow, look at what those two have done. Man, it was a nice memory.
It was an exciting phase of my life, and it was intimidating too, and you were talking about mentors like Rob. I just arrived there. I'd never really worked in English Canada. I grew up in Quebec, right? So I started working in an English environment, but it was all new to me. And covering federal politics, having more scrutiny on my work, all of this stuff was happening at the same time. Working sources was kind of new to me because I was kind of almost like a foreign correspondent in Quebec City, working for CP. All this stuff's happening at the same time, and I'm meeting folks like Scott, and it was a little intimidating at first. And Rob Russo, pulled me aside early on and said, no one's better than you. Just go in there, hold your head up high, and things will be okay. And they were. And it was great to meet folks like Scott. Forever grateful.
Awesome stories, guys. I appreciate you sharing them. We try and send this message out to students that I spoke at a graduation ceremony last week at a career academy here in Ottawa. And I was reminding them they may actually be a mentor to somebody else in their own class. They don't even know it. There's so many mentoring opportunities that exist every day that you can take advantage of helping someone or leaning into someone. So don't hesitate to ask too. So last question, and we'll let you guys get off for Christmas vacation. Hopefully you're not having to deal with an airport today. I did that last night. Prediction. Do you have one for 2025? I know you love making predictions, Scott. I'm going to go with the fact I believe there will be a federal election next year. I know it's legislated. We have to have one, Scott. Don't worry. But I do believe we'll have one.
I definitely think we're going to have one just because I can't see the NDP being able to rationalize supporting the government through the spring and the fall. But I'm going to give you a weird prediction. My prediction, I'll go to provincial politics. I think Doug Ford's in trouble. I think that the underlying numbers, Doug Ford looks strong. The guys who run his government, a couple of them are close friends of mine. But I think his position is more precarious than people think. And if he ends up calling an early election, I think he'll be reduced to a minority, one maybe even lose outright. I just think there's ingredients there for trouble. So that's my wild and ridiculous prediction, which will surely be wrong. I've now helped Doug Ford by saying this because almost certainly, the 49ers are not going to win the Super Bowl. So anything I say then for sure goes.
We could end up with another version of the greatest political quote of all time, in my opinion. David Peterson, 38 days ago, this seemed like a really good idea. I believe it's what he said on election night when they lost.
That's funny.
Alex?
Look, I mostly got out of the predictions business after the 2016 U.S. election, but if you're forcing me to make a call here, stock market takes a tumble next year. Although it's for the record, I'm saying this on Thursday, December 19th. And I've been believing this obviously for a few months now. It's already starting to show some signs of shakiness. Price earnings ratio is completely out of whack. It historically makes no sense where it is right now. So it's due for a correction, maybe a big one. If that happens next year, Donald Trump going around threatening to put tariffs on everybody, suddenly it takes on a whole different hue. And Scott alluded to this earlier. It might take a while for people to turn on this tariff idea. Maybe a little quicker if the stock market starts to take a nosedive. But again, knowing Joe Biden's left, that market might crash before January 20th and then he gets blamed.
You just reminded me of a thought I had when I had a conversation with Evan Solomon on this in the fall. Journalists are a lot like political staffers. You just walk through about 5 different topics at depth. in the last half hour we've been together. That's what political staffers have to do, manage different files, jumping around. I like dealing with the guys at Finance and Industry or Indu now, or whatever they're called, ICID. Worst named department in the history of Canada. ICID, it even sounds like a terrorist organization. And it's interesting to hear you talk about different topics. The journalism people that we get to know are very, very exceedingly bright people. So I want to thank both of you. I don't put you in that category, Scott, as you know. You're witty.
No, I appreciate that.
Alex is right. But I really appreciate you guys taking time. Sorry?
I was just going to say, you never want to be, you never want to be praised by for your intelligence by someone that the world views as a little sketch. So
You're referring to me, I assume, Scott.
I am, yes. No,
Get
I
you
think
your
Alex is right.
compliment.
I think Alex is brilliant, and his predictions about the stock market are correct. That's why I'm buying fresh water and physical gold. I'm going to hunker down in my basement. But yeah,
Well,
I was dissing you.
You're the first two people who've ever called me bright, but I will say that the journalism is the world's best training for being able to BS your way through a cocktail party. So thank you.
Appreciate you guys taking the time. I hope both of you managed to get a good break. I think there's an ironic twist around the 27th of December. The Prime Minister walks out somewhere and ruins your holiday, Scott, and you're glued to a computer live on TV for a week. It's a possibility, isn't it?
It feels like a very strong likelihood, yeah.
So with that, we'll leave this edition of the EdUp Canada podcast. Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Alex. And we look forward to seeing you all or having you listen to us all in the new year. Thanks for listening. Thanks for listening to another episode of the EdUp Canada podcast. We release new episodes regularly, so make sure you hit that subscribe button so you know when they are officially out. If you love this episode, please leave a 4 or 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcasts, so that others can also discover how a set of skills can lead to success. Thanks for learning with us.